Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're talking the biggest positive and the biggest negative from the first half of the season. We're going to be joined by Andrew Dukowitz, his own coverage. We'll each give our biggest pro and biggest con at the midseason All-Star break checkpoint here. It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Thursday, everybody. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. A big thank you here off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. We're going to be joined by Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage. He does a great job covering the Wolves for Zone Coverage, and we're going to have a discussion today about we're going to say the biggest positive takeaway and biggest negative takeaway, biggest pro, biggest con, however you want to say it, here at the All-Star break, the unofficial midway point of the regular season, 56 games in. I'm going to ask him for his positive. I'll give my positive. We'll each give a negative. We'll discuss where the Wolves go from here and take kind of a half step back and look at this thing from a more macro view. So we're going to jump right into that today and spend the whole show doing that. So without further ado, well, actually, slightly further ado, a big thank you for making this show your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube. You can also listen wherever you listen to podcasts. You can watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app if you haven't already downloaded it on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. And also a reminder that you can subscribe to the daily newsletter at lockedondaily.com. You'll get a Locked On Wolves newsletter to your email inbox every day, Monday through Friday. Again, sign up at lockedondaily.com. All right, no more further ado. We're going to go ahead and get into the conversation, myself and Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage. All right, as promised, joined by Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage. We're going to chat a little bit about the positives and negatives of the season so far for the Wolves. Obviously, big picture, like everybody expected this team to be better than where they are right now. At this point last year, I think they were still the 1 seed in the West. They finished third in the West, only a game out of the 1 seed, won 56 games. And at this point, like winning 50 games would be a really strong post All-Star break run. But still, there are positives to talk about from the first half of the season. No doubt. I just, the last couple of days, did individual player grades. There's a couple players that really stood out as having strong first halves. And so we're each going to give kind of an overall, like I guess it could be an individual. I don't know what yours are, Andrew, and you don't know what mine are, but it could be an individual player. It could be more of kind of a macro team, concept or trend. So we're going to start with the positives, then we'll hit some negatives, and we may peek ahead here and kind of predict something about the post All-Star break portion of the schedule. So I guess let's go ahead and get into it. What's your biggest positive takeaway from the first half pre All-Star break portion of the regular season, that, sitting here right now, you'd say, this is a good thing, this trend is positive, or this result from the first half of the season is a good thing?
And I appreciate you having me back on. I mean, a three-peat of Locked On coverages, it's an honor. I guess in terms of like positives of the first half of the season, my biggest takeaway is just the development of some of the younger guys. I mean, beginning of the season, I think fans, organizationally, writers, nationally, everyone was kind of a little bummed out that like Jaden McDaniels wasn't taking a big step forward. Rob wasn't really getting a lot of playing time. Even Ant, was kind of in a lull at the beginning of the season. And then really kind of since January, mid-December, early January, things have just kind of taken a turn. I mean, Dante was playing great before he got hurt. Jaden is looking like he could be the third best player on the team again. Nikhil has been great all season, but has continued that like sustained activity. And now we're seeing, Jalen Clark, what a find he was in the second round last year. Terrence Shannon Jr. looks like he could be a playoff rotation guy if absolutely needed. Rob is still struggling at times, but looking more consistent the more minutes he's getting. And just we're finally starting to see the depth of this team and maybe more of like the blueprint of what they had at the beginning of the season. I think if there's one other thing that I'd take away as a positive is, they traded Cat right before training camp. They added 2 guys into their main rotation. They've had losing streaks. They've had injuries. Dante went down. Julius went down. Mike's been, really not that good this season, whether it's injury related or just age related. Rudy is also taken a step back this season. And despite all of that, they are still the 7 seed, and they're 3.5 games behind Houston for the 4 seed in a home playoff series. I guess those would be my 2 takeaways. Young guys are starting to come along, and despite all of the things that happened this year, they're still right there.
Yeah. And I guess on your young guy, well, actually, let's start with your second point first. I agree 100%. Like, I talked about this a little bit on Wednesday's show. I think it was Wednesday's show, or at some point this week. Like, if you look at everything that has gone wrong, other than, you could even lump health in there, obviously, knock on wood, like, Ant's been healthy, and most of the starters have been healthy, Rudy and those guys. It's really just the recent injuries to DiVincenzo and Randle that have really thrown things off. But the team's been relatively healthy, given how bad they've played, how many close games they've lost. You look at their point differential, you look at the standings, and to be only 3.5, 4 games out of the 4 spot, and they have the majority of tiebreakers right now in the Western Conference. They've just lost to East teams, they've lost to bad teams, they've lost to the Portlands. So yeah, given everything, if they just have if the second half mirrors what they did for most of last season in any way at all, or really what they've done in the first half, just winning some of those close games, if the ball bounces right, if they fix their end of game execution, then yeah, we could still be talking about a top 4 seed. To your point on the young players, I think that's super interesting because, I think Jaden is kind of his own thing because he's going to get minutes and he's going to play regardless. He's a starter. But it's interesting. You mentioned Dillingham and Terrence Shannon, and I'm curious to see, and Jalen Clark, you could put in that category, who's still on a 2-way contract. Like, how much are these guys going to play when DiVincenzo comes back, when Mike Conley's fully healthy? What's that minutes distribution going to look like? And, are they still going to all have rotation roles? Is Chris Finch going to expand his rotation to 10 or even 11 guys and just play guys less minutes? Or is it going to be, sorry, TJ Shannon, you're not playing anymore. Sorry, Jalen Clark, you're not playing. Dillingham's minutes get shrunk. What's that going to look like?
So it's one of those things where Finch always answers the question as he wants to get to a 9.5 guy rotation. So take it with a grain of salt of kind of what he says, because it's from day one of this season is I want 9.5, maybe even 10 guys in a rotation. And that's just never really come to fruition. I do think we're going to see players resting more the second half. I think Finch has learned, if anything, that his backups, especially at guards and wings, are capable of playing 20, 25 minutes a night. So I wouldn't be surprised if Mike is now resting, 1 out of every 4 games. I wouldn't be surprised if Rudy is getting some more rest breaks at the end of the season. You might even see Julius coming back from his injury get scheduled days off, because groin injuries can kind of linger sometimes. And even Dante with the turf toe. I wouldn't be surprised if they're giving him some days off at times too. The only guy I think, only 2 guys, I guess, that I think won't really get time off is probably Jaden and Ant. And that's more because of that's how they're wired. They want to play every game versus wanting to take days off. But I think there's going to be more opportunities where, Mike is sitting out a game. The next game, Dante is sitting out. A couple games later, Rudy's out. The game after that, Julius is out. And we're seeing more of just like a rotating cast of bench players versus just a strict 8-man lineup that Finch had been doing. That's just my guess, though. It could be, completely the opposite. Finch has also been talking a lot at practices of just, they haven't given themselves any margin of error. They kind of blew the first half of the season. So now every game is crucial. Yep. And when every game is crucial, you're probably not as likely to throw out a 19, 20-year-old to, play 25 minutes.
Yeah. And that's 100% correct. Like, if they had given themselves any cushion at all, then I think we'd be more likely to see that. And it's interesting too. They've only got 4 more back-to-backs the rest of the season, and 2 of them are before the end of February. They've got 2 more. They've got the home and home against OKC next week, actually next Sunday, Monday. and then one more at the end of next week. And then they've got 3 in the next 2 weeks, and they've only got one more the whole rest of the season. So especially coming off the injuries, to your point, this actually wouldn't be a shock if between Randle, DiVincenzo, Conley, Gobert, all guys who have missed time recently, if there's a couple of those, if in those 3 back-to-backs, there's some scheduled days off there, because then you don't have another one until the week before the playoffs start. And at that point, hopefully, they're not fighting for seeding. I mean, they probably will be, but we'll see, but really the whole month of March, they've got over a month there with no back-to-backs. So that could look really different. All right. Next, I want to get into my positive takeaway, and then we'll hit a couple of, we'll call them negative. I guess they are negative takeaways at the midway point through the season, or things that haven't gone as planned. We'll say that. We'll get to that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. There's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature. Keeps every moment of the game exciting. I mean, if it's a late Timberwolves rally or you're picking Anthony Edwards to hit a clutch 3, you'll never feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is really easy to use. When you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so my positive takeaway is something I talked about recently on the show, actually kind of at length, but we'll hit it quickly here today, and I want to get your take on it. But I think it was obvious this was happening already, and then Chris Finch acknowledged this in a post-game press conference a couple of weeks ago. But the Timberwolves have a clear shift in philosophy when it comes to their offense, and specifically offensive rebounding. If you look at what they did, and I'm using January 1st as somewhat arbitrary, but it's not really, because that's kind of when we started to see this team play better. Is like, if you look at pre-January 1st, this Timberwolves team was 20th in offensive rating, according to Cleaning the Glass. They were 20th in free throw rate as an offense and 17th in offensive rebound rate. Since January 1st, which is a total of, let's see, how many games is that? 24 games since January 1st. The Wolves are 7th in offensive rating on Cleaning the Glass. They're first in free throw rate. So they went from 20th to 1st in free throw rate. They went from 17th to 5th in offensive rebound rate. And overall, they went from 20th to 7th in terms of their overall offensive rating. There's been a clear dedication to crashing the glass, to taking advantage of that. And Chris Finch, I can't remember, it might have been the Rockets game a couple of weeks ago, post-game, he was asked about it, and he basically was like, the way he described it reminded me of, like, this is the new inefficiency, right? Kind of like the three-point shot was 20 years ago, or like in baseball where it was, the Moneyball A's, and then it was the Tampa Bay Rays, and defense was an inefficiency, and so they loaded up on defensive, talented outfielders or whatever. Like, there's these moments throughout sports where teams find the inefficiency. You could look at football and spread offenses to now loading the box, and like, this is the new kind of zig to the zag. A couple years ago for the Wolves, they tried to go the last 2 years, super big, which was kind of a zig to the zag of the small ball. This is kind of the new thing, because if you're crashing 5 and 1 or 2 guys are leaking out the other way, you're going to have an advantage on the offensive glass. And that's clearly given the Wolves more opportunities overall on offense. It's given them more rim attempts. Like, that's another area that's increased dramatically. They were 22nd in attempts at the rim before January 1st. They're now 6th in terms of percentage of their shots that are at the rim. That's in large part driven by offensive rebounding. Yes, they've been a little more aggressive going to the basket, but it's because they're generating more opportunities on offense by offensive rebounding more frequently. And to me, that's been a huge, the fact that they've made that shift midseason and been willing to shift their philosophy, to me, has been really impressive, because that's not at all how this team played for the last year and a half.
I mean, Finch did. He talked about it that post game. I can't remember the exact quote either, but it was like, you gotta, in this new NBA, you gotta crash the glass. Like, there are so many teams that are leaking out. And then I think a couple of weeks later, he was asked about, like, fast break, how they've been doing, kind of covering in transition and fast break. And he said, one of his answers to that was, we crash the offensive glass. If we're crashing the glass, teams can't go out and leak as much because like we're going to get the offensive rebound. And to your point, I mean, Rudy Gobert has been phenomenal on offensive rebounds. The other guy that's been like surprisingly good, Jaden McDaniels. Again, he's, over his career, he averages about 1 offensive rebound a game. He's up to 1.5 on this season. And I think he's closer to 2 since January, which for your small forward to be getting 2 offensive rebounds, Rudy, I think is at 2.5 or 3, maybe. It has been a focus for this team. And I think it's been kind of a solution to the transition woes they had earlier in the season. I mean, if you can't get back and you can't get your big guys back fast enough to get in transition, you might as well have them offensive rebound and just punch it back in.
Yeah, to your point on Jaden, his offensive rebound rate is up it's almost 5.5%, which is 2.2 points higher than where it was last year, and it's easily a career high. And you could trace it back to the playoffs last year. I mean, they had him corner crashing against Phoenix by design, and it worked really well. And I just think overall his activity level improved in the playoffs. He had a bit of a dip early this season, I thought, activity level wise, but recently he's been great. And I gave him a B+ in my player grades the other day because I just really think that he's just been more active in the half court, and offensive rebound is a big part of that. And I think he's been a little more active off the dribble too, or trying to score off the dribble. And yeah, I mean, getting out in transition. I mentioned the rim frequency, and then the other stat I cited, it might've been last week when I talked about this a little bit, but on cleaning the glass, there's a stat that's putbacks points per miss. So how many putback points does the team score per 100 missed field goals / reboundable free throws? So basically, when you miss a shot as an offense, how many points do you still generate per 100 possessions? And the Wolves are second in the league, next to only Houston since January 1st, at 27.5 points per 100 missed field goals, which is crazy. And then they're third in plays per 100 misses. So again, how many actual opportunities are you generating off of the offensive glass? And the Wolves have it can be just a really kind of silly volume-based stat when you just look at the end of the game, which team attempted more shots. And a lot of times that's the team that attempts more shots is in better shape because they've turned it over less times. They've got more offensive rebounds. Obviously that's not always true. You mix in free throw attempts and stuff like that. But I think that's something where the Wolves have done a much better job of that recently. And that's been a big part of their offensive improvement. All right, shifting gears. Let's talk about sitting here now at the All-Star break. What is a specific thing beyond just obviously the record that's been disappointing or has a person or a thing that has undelivered to this point in the season, underdelivered to this point in the season? Why don't you give yours first, Andrew?
I'm going to take kind of a macro approach at this. I think the Karl Anthony Towns trade hurt this team a lot more than they ever could have expected. I think just they've had to change their entire kind of offensive philosophy to moving more through Ant. Cat gets traded, and now Mike Conley sitting in the corner, not handling the ball as much. The new guys did not gel as well as they thought they would. And then even to Rob and Terrence, Chris Finch kind of tipped his hand, not tipped his hand, but kind of said the quiet part out loud of we drafted Terrence Shannon Jr. to be a backup wing and play. And then we traded Cat and got Dante and Randle. So I think that's the most disappointing part, is that we traded Karl Anthony Towns so close to the beginning of the season, and it just really decimated this team. I mean, chemistry wise, flow wise, offensive strategy wise, even their defense, they aren't able to do the same things with Randle as they were with Cat. And, if you're just playing 2K and you make that trade, all of the players just, you log in the next day and you're playing online and it's the same team and you're controlling everything. But when you have personalities and people that are used to doing certain things and used to having to stand in certain spots of the floor, and now all of a sudden it's all gone, I think that just really messed with this team a lot. And, I'm kind of hesitant to grade this team on the first half of the season just because of how many different iterations of the Wolves we had. I mean, at the beginning of the season, we had Mike Conley not hitting shots, a kind of passive Anthony Edwards. Jaden wasn't hitting shots. It just really messed with them. I guess if I was going to take a more micro thing, and this one pains me, but just Mike Conley's fall off. He mentioned it in training camp that he hurt his wrist against Denver last season, and he wasn't able to do like his normal off-season routine because he was rehabbing his wrist the whole time. Came into the training camp, still had his wrist taped. It's on his shooting hand. And he, to his credit, will never blame anything on an injury, but he just, whether it's not being able to do his off-season stuff, whether it's father time taking its toll, or whether it's that wrist injury, he has just really not performed to where I think he, the Wolves fans, anyone expected him to be at. And because he hasn't performed at that level, it's kind of left the Wolves without a point guard. And that's something that, you know, Rudy desperately needs a point guard to set him up. Ant works really well in a two-man game, and they just need that calming presence. And if Mike isn't able to do it at this stage of his career or because of injury, it's going to be tough come playoff time.
Yeah. To your first point on the trade, it is one of those where like the true answer is somewhere in the middle. And by that, I mean, like, you know, you talk to somebody who's not a Timberwolves fan or who's a casual NBA fan, they're like, I can't believe the Wolves made that trade. Like, I've had those conversations with people. It'll be like, I mean, why did they do that? And it's like, okay, well, there's obvious financial reasons why they did it. I understand why they did it. My answer is always like, hey, I thought they'd be able to go another year with Cat and they would have made the trade this summer. That's kind of what I thought from the beginning. It's what I've always said on the show. So the timing, given that it was before the season and also very literally right before training camp, that's the toughest thing, because the return itself, if you had to trade Cat, wasn't that terrible. DiVincenzo and Randle are good players. It was the timing. It was the impact, to your point, on, you know, the actual people involved in the trade. We saw DiVincenzo take a full 2 months to really be comfortable. Julius Randle, kind of the same thing. And, you know, Cat just is still Cat in New York and in some ways having a career year. Obviously a lot more eyeballs on him now. And, but yeah, I mean, like that's a really good point and really obvious. The Conley thing is kind of like half of what I was going to give for mine. So I'll get to mine here in a second. And then we'll kind of take a look at, take a half step back and just look at like, hey, what's a prediction for what's going to happen down the stretch here this season? We'll do that here next after a short break. All right. So giving my negative or my concerning piece here at the All-Star break, related to what you said about Mike Conley, what I have down for mine is really what's turned into what appears to be some sort of regression, or at least the concern would be potential regression, late stage career regression of both Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert. The Wolves obviously invested heavily in those guys and are very reliant on them. Now, this point would have been probably better taken 2 to 3 weeks ago, before Mike Conley started shooting lights out again. I mean, I think he's like over 43% over the last month from three, and Rudy Gobert has played better of late. And you mentioned the injury to Mike Conley. So that certainly plays into this. And I mean, you can go back and look at how Conley performed in the conference finals last year, and his shooting numbers were way down too after he suffered the injury against Denver. And so clearly that had an impact, whether it's the wrist itself or his inability to do his normal offseason routine because of the wrist. Clearly there's been an element of those guys. I don't know that playing into shape is the right term, because I'm not suggesting they're out of shape, but like getting their legs underneath them and feeling comfortable, which is funny because they're veterans, but sometimes like that, it takes a little bit for that to happen. So, you know, maybe this isn't a real concern, and we'll see. We talked already about kind of the dreaded or the term load management has a negative connotation, but like scheduled off days for these guys in the second, you know, the post All-Star break part of the schedule. So maybe this ends up not being a thing, but it's a little bit concerning just because, I mean, Conley's 37 and Rudy is 32. And at some point these guys are going to regress. Conley's still under contract for next year for like 10 million. And Rudy obviously just got the extension, which is with a lower average annual value, but an extension nonetheless. So their wagon is still hitched to these guys, likely for at least, you know, in Conley's case, another year, and Rudy beyond that. The silver lining has been recently, at least, we've seen some, as you talked about earlier, Rob Dillingham and Jalen Clark and Terrence Shannon. These guys have gotten a chance to play more and generally play well. But this team's going to go how Ant goes, yes, but as we saw in the playoffs, it can't just be Ant. Mike Conley has to shoot better than 35% from three, like he did against Dallas or whatever, and Rudy's got to come to the party in the playoffs too. So I have a little bit of concern about how these guys. I mean, Mike Conley really wore down toward the end of last season. Yeah. Are they going to be able to keep these guys healthy? Are they going to continue peaking, the late stages of the regular season into the playoffs, or is there regression or I guess serious concerns with their age and their ability to perform into April and May and hopefully beyond? Is that going to crop up in the playoffs again?
That's my concern. More so with Conley than Gobert. I mean, Gobert's kind of proven that he's a minutes eater and he'll get his 20 minutes and get rebounds and be somewhat effective, even if I mean, the thing that's driven, Chris Finch has talked about it pretty blatantly of just like his rebounding woes this season. I think that's the thing that they might miss the most if Rudy kind of regresses. If Mike regresses at the playoffs and, it really puts them in a bind because Dante, yes, can play point guard, but in the playoffs, when the game slows down, when every turnover is magnified, Mike's a guy that's going to take care of the ball, going to get everyone involved. And he's really that like old school, 80s, 90s, and 2000s point guard that is hyper conscious of, Rudy hasn't touched the ball in 6 possessions. We got to get it to him. Julius hasn't had the ball in 3 possessions. Let's get it into a post up. I really worry about Mike Conley, and hopefully it is, his wrist is doing good. He's back into shape now. I think for him, it is kind of fair to say that he had to play himself into shape a little bit, but I think those two guys, you are right. That is how far this team will go. If Rudy is an all-star level center, this team could really surprise and upset a couple rounds. And if Mike is playing at, peak Mike last season, they could, the sky turns into the limit for them again. They have the depth, they have the scoring, they have the defense.
Yeah, and Rudy, the rebounding thing, I talked about this a little bit. I think it was Tuesday's show this week when I did midseason grades. I mean, the rebounding thing is the biggest concern, and Chris Finch has called it out, as you said, but like his defensive rebound rate is like 6 points worse than his next lowest defensive rebound rate in his career, and it's like 7 points worse than last year. The offensive rebound rate is bouncing back a little bit here recently because the Wolves kind of renewed focus on that. And it makes a ton of sense for Rudy to be active on the offensive glass. Like he's not going to beat anybody back in transition anyway. So he should be active on the offensive glass. So hopefully that's a continued trend. And that could be related to getting his legs underneath him and all that stuff too. And to your point, Rudy's never really looked worn down. I mean, the beginning of his first season in Minnesota was, he had an illness, I think. And there was some, coming out of Eurobasket, he was banged up and all that stuff. But like, Rudy's a workhorse. Like he's going to play minutes. He's going to play games regardless of whether or not he's hurt. He's going to be out there. And I don't worry about conditioning and legs for him as much other than just the age thing. And then the activity level, like even though he's out there, will he be as active? And we've seen games where he's been less active than others. So who knows? I mean, come playoff time, like he was good in the playoffs last year. Obviously there's some matchups that are tougher than others to have Rudy on the floor. I mean, I think it was the Houston game a couple of weeks ago. The Wolves closed with Dawes at the 5 because they were just so dynamic offensively. They're still going to have that option. But they still need Rudy Gobert to do what he does, especially on the glass and on the defensive end of the floor. All right, let's close by just kind of an overall takeaway or I guess, looking ahead really. There's 26 games left in the regular season. The Wolves have the 5th easiest schedule, 4th or 5th, depending on where you look, easiest strength of schedule remaining. They get to play, other than those Thunder and Rockets games right out of the break, then the schedule gets really easy, which I guess depending on your perspective could be good, could be bad for the Wolves. I don't know what's your kind of like, what are you looking forward to, or what are you expecting, or what's a prediction, anything here over the final, 2-ish months of the regular season?
So the Wolves get 2 games against the Nuggets, 2 against the Thunder. They play the Rockets. They're going to have an opportunity to move up in the standings like quickly. And if they can take advantage of the head-to-head matchups against the Nuggets, against the Thunder, they have one against the Grizzlies. They could get up to where they are in that, 2 or 3 2 or 3 spot contention with Denver and Memphis. I think that's what I'm most looking forward to, is the opportunity if they have really hammered everything out. I guess if there's something for the rest of the season that I'm pretty fearful of, it is the weak schedule. This team has proven that they just don't wake up for easy opponents, which is really reminiscent of, I think, 22-23, where they dropped a bunch of games and got blown out by the Pistons. And
they
like,
finished
if they have,
I think that year.
Yeah. It's one of those things where no one has an answer for it. And that's what might be the most frustrating. Finch will go out after practice and say, we had a good practice. Guys are energized. They have a chip on their shoulder. They're ready for this game. Mike will come out. Ant will come out. Everyone will appear ready. And then they just sleepwalk through the first half, catch all the way back up, make the game thrilling, and then lose it. And then after the game, they're all kind of sitting there going, we need to figure out how to find an edge in these games. Yeah. I mean, it's to the point in the locker room where, like, Mike is talking about, like, how difficult it is for Jaden and Ant to have, like, less than year-old children. And Jaden's talking about, like, maybe I'm spending too much time with my family. Yeah. Like, they're really searching for why this happens. Honestly, I think it's going to start and end with Ant, though. If Ant really comes out of this all-star break and he has that, like, killer mindset where he's, you know, telling the president of former President Obama that he's the truth and he's going to back that up, they're going to win those games. If Ant is still having those games where he's just not really engaged in the first quarter, I think they're going to have a lot more of those dropped against lesser opponents. And then they'll probably go out and beat the Thunder and the Rockets, and we'll probably be talking about them being a 5 or 6 seed.
Yeah, I feel like we'll have I mean, it does actually feel like it's possible they'll come out and win 2 out of 3 against the Thunder and Rockets or whatever. And then it's like, all right, Wolves are back. And then they lose to whoever the bad teams are in the schedule right after that. That's just kind of how this year has gone. It's very much reminiscent of that 22-23 season, because that was coming off of the 6th seed where they took Memphis to 6 games. It was the first playoff series, you know, in forever, and Finch's first year, and everybody's like, all right, here we go. And then they're down in the play-in. They barely make it to the 8th seed. They lose in 5 to Denver. And then last year it's, you know, conference finals. And now this year it's, you know, somewhere in between most likely. But yeah, I mean, my prediction, I said this the other day on the show, so I'm cheating a little bit, but I think they'll finish 4th in the West. They're only 3.5 behind Houston. They've got the 5th best point differential in the West. They've got like the 7th or 8th best point differential in the entire NBA. I think they're on the upswing. I think guys like Conley and Gobert are, even though they're a little banged up, I think it's more rest than anything else. They're kind of sort of peaking at the right time. As we talked about, the young guys now are getting some confidence and some run. The biggest thing for me is how DiVincenzo and Randle get reacclimated, as long as they can figure that out. You know, and as long as it's not like it was in October, November, where it was just super clunky. If they could kind of get back to where they were right before those guys got hurt, then I think they'll be in great shape, combined with the schedule. And, you know, to the point I made earlier, like they've got after OKC, they have the best record against the Western Conference. Like they have most of the tiebreakers. They've played well against tough opponents in the West. They're just like 8-11 against the Eastern Conference, which there's no excuse for that. Yeah. You know, obviously they lost to Washington without Ant, and they lost to Toronto, and they, you know, some of these just like silly losses. They have the Sixers twice still, which hopefully should be winning games they can win. They have the Nets still. So all that to say, if they can manage to not do that, I think they finish 4th in the West. Like I think that's really truly on the table for the Wolves. All right. Any final thoughts? Anything you want to promote at all, Andrew?
Today, day of recording, Wednesday, this afternoon, a Kevin Durant conspiracy theory article will be dropping on Zone Coverage. I dug really deep into the Suns salary cap and why this trade is going to happen for the Suns, whether it comes to Minnesota or not. But if you are interested in that, if you've been seeing all the Kevin Durant stuff like I do, and you are more interested in why the heck the Suns would want to get off of him, it'll be on Zone Coverage by the time this episode comes out. So go check it out.
Awesome. Yeah, go check that out at Zone Coverage. As Andrew said, it is live now. Big thank you for joining today on the show, Andrew, and we'll have you on again soon.
Appreciate it, Ben.
All right, there you have it. Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage. I always enjoy having him on, a good perspective on a handful of different things. So I'll be back tomorrow. May have a guest tomorrow. Still working to nail that down for Friday's show. But either way, we'll preview the Rockets game on Friday night and a bit of second half of the season. I'll do more than just a standings prediction. I'll do some second half predictions on Friday as well. So we'll see you then. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can also subscribe to the daily newsletter at lockedondaily.com. One stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your email inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. Once again, this episode, or not this episode, this show is always part of the Locked On Sports Network, the Locked On Podcast Network. Of course, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.